I'll say a little bit about Film Comment. Film Comment is a publication of Film at Lincoln Center, which is where you are right now, and which also organizes the New York Film Festival. Film Comment has been around since 1962, and since then has published rigorous coverage of independent, art house, international, blockbuster, all kinds of cinema. We currently have a weekly podcast that's free to subscribe to called the Film Comment Podcast, where we gather together directors and critics and other interesting voices in film culture to talk about whatever's new in movies. And we also have a weekly newsletter called the Film Comment Letter, also free, delivered directly to your inboxes every Friday with original reviews, interviews, essays, and more. So again, if you're not a subscriber, please consider going to filmcomment.com and subscribing to both platforms. Every year at the New York Film Festival, we do a series of talks called Film Comment Live. The idea is to create a kind of critical component, a critical counterpart to the festival's films, to kind of reflect on the year's selection from the point of view from our point of view as cultural commentators. So we try to find the films that really feel like they speak to us, but also would speak to the moment from the lineup and build a conversation around it with the film's directors. And this year we knew very quickly which two films we were going to try and do a talk with. And those were Union, directed by Brett Story and Stephen Maing, in the Spotlight section of the festival, which is about the struggle of a group of workers at the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island to form a union, to form an autonomous union to demand better work conditions. And the other film that immediately caught our eye was Northern Lights by John Hanson and Rob Nilsson, which is actually a film from the 1970s, but about a different chapter in the American history of labor struggle, which is about the formation of the nonpartisan league in North Dakota of farmers who wanted to collectivize to build some bulwarks against exploitation by banks and railroads and other capitalist tycoons. And seeing these two films in different sections of the lineup, but sort of presented together, felt like an incredible opportunity to bring together two sets of filmmakers who've worked closely with movements, important movements in American history, to document what it's like to participate in people power, and to do that also through the form of their film, which is very much reflecting the nature of a collective movement. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm very honored to invite onto the stage, first of all, the directors of Union, Brett Story and Stephen Maing. And the directors of Northern Lights, Rob Nilsson and John Hanson. And my co-editor at Film Comment, Clinton Krute, will be co-hosting the conversation, so please welcome him onto the stage as well. All right, thank you all so much for joining us. This is very special right now because it really feels like this cross-generational conversation, this chance to reflect on movies and movement separated by, almost half a century. And that's why we were so excited to bring the four of you together. And to start off, I do want to ask about what, for each of you, was specific to the moment in which you made your films. So John and Rob, you made this film in the 1970s about a struggle that happened in 1915. So what was happening in the 1950s that made this feel like a very important story to tell? And for you, Brett and Steve, what felt specific to you about this moment of labor struggle in America that felt like it had to be committed to film?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that not only mention the film, but we banded together to make a collective film organization for the purpose of making films about working people, be they agrarian or industrial or whatever. And we also to study the films that had been made before our time and during our time. We studied the neorealists, the Italian neorealists. We studied Globo Rocha and Cinema Novo, and many of the other more, well, Pera de los Santos, others. And so John is the guy who should be talking about how we got started with North Dakota. So John, you should.
Well, I grew up in North Dakota, and my grandfather was a member of the Nonpartisan League back in those days. And he told me stories about that, which I didn't really pay much attention to. We weren't taught about the Nonpartisan League in school, didn't know anything about it. But in the collective, Cine Manifest in San Francisco, we each had our own specific project that we were developing. There were 6 of us, we had 6 different projects, and mine was, I decided to do a film about the Nonpartisan League. And Rob has roots in North Dakota. His grandfather was the first real filmmaker in North Dakota way back when.
1907.
And in fact, we used some of Rob's grandfather's footage in a documentary we made about the Nonpartisan League called Prairie Fire, which is part of Prairie Trilogy, which Kino Lorber also distributes. And so Rob and I banded together to tell this North Dakota story about a movement that nobody really knew about. It had been forgotten, and we thought it was. I really thought it was important to do something about that. And I knew the land well. I knew the people well. I had grown up there, so it was a natural for us to pursue this story.
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think that a couple of things were going on when we decided to make this film. One is just noticing that within the history, the long and illustrious history of labor cinema in both fiction and documentary, it's there's this gap that mirrors the decline of the labor movement. I mean, it's, as people are all, I'm sure, aware, labor's been in decline, organized labor's been in decline all over the world, but especially in the United States for multiple decades, 4 decades now. And we're, up until just the last couple of years, the country has seen, new lows in union density like never before. And so in that kind of context, of course, it would be hard to make a labor film because it's depressing. People don't want to make totally depressing films about defeat and weakness. And yet so many, certainly personally, so many of the most inspiring films, the films that made me want to become a filmmaker, are labor struggle films about ordinary people defying odds, trying to find power over their lives and their livelihoods, their communities, save their communities.
What are some examples of?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the film Harlan County, USA by Barbara Koppel is an essential document of a particular moment in labor history. But I also think of Michael Moore's Roger and Me, which is such an interesting film because it's about labor, but it's also about place, how a company makes a town and what happens to a town when industry leaves. And that film is also kind of marks a real moment in globalization out of which a new restructured economy has emerged, and the face of that economy is really Amazon at this point in time. So, when our producers Samantha and Mars first contacted Chris Smalls, who starts this unionization effort at Amazon, it was really exciting because there was a recognition that we need stories about what jobs look like today, and I think everyone during the pandemic especially became especially aware of what working life today in America revolves around these so-called essential workplaces that are really shopping hubs, logistics hubs for retail. And also there's an energy, in movements across different sectors, but part of that includes labor, a kind of interest in among a new generation of organizers in thinking about labor as an important site of struggle. And so we recognize an opportunity to make a film not only about a workplace, a kind of workplace that defines the modern global economy that hasn't been that well depicted in cinema, but also
possibly and hopefully a story of a resurgent labor movement looking forward towards the possibilities of a strengthened organized labor sector.
Yeah, I'll just add to that also what was fascinating was to kind of see right in front of us this redefinition of like what grassroots movements looked like, right? The demographic that here was a nascent group of workers, Black-led, worker-led, that were creating a community, a functional organization from the ground up. When historically you look back, in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, wonderful coup, right? It allowed, granted workers the right to collectively bargain against their employers. But the two conspicuous groups missing from that, discluded, were agricultural workers and domestic workers, predominantly Black, predominantly women. And so here was a movement, flash forward almost 90 years later, that was led by women, people of color, and yet the traditional unions were saying, we don't believe you can organize this place. So I think that was also an interesting opportunity because, we gained kind of like the trust quite readily because most of the media was not so interested.
Right. I think that's also just another resonance between the two films, of the many resonances that there are. This idea of this outsider group who's not necessarily recognized by, the major unions in one case, or, the farmers are sort of forced to organize a separate political party to a certain extent with the nonpartisan league. But you also hit on, so yeah, the name of the talk is Collective Protagonists, but neither film is really both films have individual figures at the center around which the movement kind of swirls. And I wanted to ask about the narrative structures and how you thought about telling these stories of a movement through kind of a smaller individual at the center of it. In the case of Union, Chris Smalls. In the case of Northern Lights, you have Ray Stevenson.
Well, I think that that's square one. The people themselves. John knew them better than I because he grew up there. But it starts with Henry Martinson, who you discovered, John. But it wasn't hard to find him. He was what was the union he was in?
AFL-CIO Labor Temple.
Yeah, AFL-CIO Labor Temple. Still at work, at his desk, 94 years old. And you look into his face and you see what you see. You see North Dakota, you see humor, you see a real person, not a guy with a tremendous sense of humor, and a tremendous drive for some kind of justice for people. But that's not all. And we have 3 or 4 actors we brought from San Francisco. But when you look at the faces of those people, we knew that that's what we had to use. But more than that, we had to get to know them. We had to go and live with them and experience those experiences that we were then going to translate into something that happened in 1916. So it's all about the people to me, and it's about the fortitude and about the decency of people when they get a chance. When they get a chance.
So you kind of have to gain their trust, not unlike you were saying, in terms of gaining the trust of the ALU to make a documentary. Did you feel like you had to go into these, because this was in 1978, they were no longer members of the Nonpartisan League. What was that process like of bringing these people into the filmmaking process, the non-professional actors who participated in the film?
Well, we were scouting locations around North Dakota looking for a place to shoot the film. And this Norwegian community up in northwestern North Dakota on the Canadian border was having what they called a threshing bee every summer. They brought out the old machinery from the 1900s and sort of redid the threshing as they did it back in those days. They had all the equipment, and they had the wheat in shocks already out there because they had to harvest the wheat in the fall and put it in shocks so that they'd have it for the next year. And so we went up there, And these people were a great community. They're Norwegians, and they were still speaking some of the dialect of Norwegian as well. Plus, it was a nonpartisan league stronghold, that part of North Dakota. So it was a perfect match. But Rob and I remember when we first met this group of farmers, and they were lined up and they were looking at us, a couple of long-haired hippies from San Francisco. And then they found out that I grew up there and Rob had roots, and pretty soon we started to talk, and pretty soon we become friends, and we lived with the farmers on the farms when we shot the film, and as we met them, we cast them and we wrote parts for them, and it was an organic process of bringing them into the film, and they made the film because they tell the truth when they speak.
Yeah, and my subsequent life in film has been to work not with scripts but with outlines and improvisationally. And I would have thought that that's how we would have done it, but we didn't. And John was in charge of the cinematography, and he's got an eye, and he knows what the land looks like and what faces look like against the land. And so we decided, I don't even know if we ever discussed it, but we went right ahead and said, no, we're going to use tripods. And we're going to, the first thing you have to do when you're working with non-actors is you have to, first of all, you have to have trust, but you have to dispel fear. You have to say, you can't be in any way authoritarian. You simply have to make them realize that there's no way they can fail. And they didn't, and they were able to do lines, pretty sophisticated stuff that we wrote. I wouldn't say, maybe sophistication is the wrong word, at least grounded stuff. Wonderful capacity that they had. I don't think we had, even Chris did, it was Chris Torsen, did he have lines?
Oh,
the
sure.
rock pile guy?
Yeah,
Even he learned lines.
Everybody had lines that they had to learn as any actors would. I mean, it was not improvised, and we rehearsed, and they were fearless. They didn't care. They knew us. You know.
Is that the scene when Sven and Ray are talking about the price of coffee and how that price is set? Because I thought that was such an incredible scene. I mean, it was like exciting because that scene comes up in Union, right, in Staten Island, this moment where you get to see like how workers become radicalized by the employers themselves, right? This, like the squeeze when you are told as an employee that you are to have no connection to the product of your labor, and on top of that, you are utterly disposable. And so that kind of like pushing closer and closer to the edge, and then all of a sudden realizing, oh, this whole group of workers that you are talking to now have been activated. And that's by the employers doing. And I think that like, it always boggles me, like, why do companies, corporations not talk about this more, that they are making their own worst enemy?
Yeah. No, well, I guess because of who we were, and my background is in northern Wisconsin and North Dakota and stuff, I think we kind of had the brogue down kind of through our own bloodstreams from early age. So what we wrote, I think came out of our own imaginations in contact now with this reality, and they picked it right up. No, all that I don't know. Was there any improvisation in that scene he's referring to, or was it all?
No, it was all scripted, and we shot it like one would do with a group of actors, changing the camera positions, doing the close-up here, the reaction shots, all those things, and they were right there. But of course, they had lived it, or their fathers and mothers had lived it. So this was all stuff they were familiar with too. We weren't giving them stuff to say that was, that was difficult for them to understand or believe. This was right there in their bloodstream.
So you didn't radicalize them with that when you shot the scene? You didn't blow their minds?
No, not at all.
They were already aware of this.
So going to Brett and Steve, I think that question's really interesting about balancing characters with also the truly collective nature of a process like this. And what's interesting in Union is that you see that tension being played out within the film too. I mean, within organizing as well, where you need strong leadership, but at the same time, there has to be this real sense of openness and democracy. I know that you got your in to the film through a connection to Chris Smalls, but then you actually bring in a lot of other, there's a lot of other organizers who become prominent characters, and many of them have disagreements with each other that are shown in the film. So could you talk us through that, like how to strike that balance?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, even before we had to think about balance, it really was also part of us coming into an understanding that we had a film. Of course, there's something interesting about starting a union, but who knows what's going to happen? That might peter out, and it might not even be that interesting to follow. But I think that when we started spending time with this very small group of people who were organizing even before they decided to start a union campaign, one of the things that I think was quite striking and that felt as much worth witnessing as their battle with this massive corporate giant was the care that they took with each other. And so even, something like a Zoom meeting, which you would think is so alienating and so impersonal, on these Zoom meetings, it was a kind of open call Zoom meeting. People would just hear about them and show up. A worker would say, hey, I've been working here for years, and then I heard that you guys are doing something, so I just showed up. This is my name. This is my shift. Here's my complaint. This thing happened to me. And other folks on that call would say, I hear you. I've been there. I've got your back. Okay, listen, we'll go talk to your manager, next week. And I think that thinking about how these workers were relating to each other was really kind of the driving core of us even being able to imagine that there would be a film. So then it had to be a film about a collective. And I think, even the word collective is complicated because it's sort of like, sort of has this virtue to it. Like a collective is a good thing, right? Like community. But nobody in life has a lot of practice being part of a collective. We're not, everything that we do in life, we go to school, we get jobs, we apply for grants. We're trained to be individuals against each other. We're not trained and learn the skills to be doing stuff as a kind of social unit. And so even I think the idea of a union, which you would assume is all about the collective, people, while trying a union drive, still had to learn in real time how to do something together, how to negotiate being together, and working across like very serious differences, the kind of differences that Steve mentioned. I mean, the like real axes of race and gender and class that make people feel that show up in different kinds of vulnerabilities, and that can be terribly disorganizing, like purposefully disorganizing, right? That's sort of the way race and class and gender function, is to pit groups against each other and to say to people, you have different interests. Your interests are not, in fact, aligned. You should not join forces. And so the work is to join forces. The work is to see one's interests as aligned. But that's like, those are skills just as much as organizing is. And it was really important for us in thinking about, why should this be a film? Why should audiences meet this group of people and watch this thing happen, especially when we don't know what the outcome is going to be, for us to really commit to this idea of watching a group of people, a changing group of people, figure out in real time how to do something together.
So that was sort of present from the beginning when you guys were first conceptualizing the film, because I was wondering if there's a version of the film that's like the Chris Smalls story, like Union : the Chris Smalls story.
Someone will make that.
Right. Because it's, and I was imagining, like, in real time, you have to be making decisions about what to focus on at any given moment. So what was that process like? And I also think, like, just as an aside, the images of the Zoom meetings are just these kind of, it just occurred to me watching this film, like, this is a powerful metaphor in a way. Everybody's the same size, everybody's sort of like holding up their hands to talk. There's like a really powerful metaphor for community there in a way that I hadn't thought of Zoom meetings before. So go ahead.
I mean, the Zoom is a perfect kind of visual metaphor to also start to understand how well, maybe Chris was the de facto leader of the ALU, but this idea of like racial capitalism crossed a red line for so many different kinds of people, right? I mean, there were mothers and there were workers who, were single parents or Latinx or came recently to this country, and all of that shared indignation. I mean, across the political spectrum too, like there were Trump supporters as much as there were radical lefties. And I think that shared indignation and kind of like basic inability to survive because of this shared feeling that, we heard over and over, they treat us like fucking robots, was this catalyzing kind of energy that it wasn't like a kind of political manifesto. It's just this feeling that like we all are fighting for our lives, and we're fighting now, we realize, for the lives of other workers if we so choose. And so I think that then led to this idea that like a realization actually that like so many different workers that were coming to this union effort brought different kinds of resources, skills, forms of identification. So, like Natalie Monarez, she had this great ability to kind of like connect as a Latinx woman to other marginalized groups, and there were, Angie Maldonado, single Black mom, was, had a very great ability to connect with all of those other kinds of parents struggling similarly to her. And everybody, I think, could feel that, even if Chris was the center of that, the union's orbit often, there were so many other skill sets and powerful contributions.
Just talking about these Zoom meetings is making me think about actually the visual beauty of both films. It's not very fun to watch screens on screen sometimes. And both of, all of you put a lot of effort into bringing out the poetics of labor, the poetics of community. I mean, Northern Lights is, frequently regarded as just one of the most beautiful to watch independent films about labor. I mean, these images of the farmers, in this North Dakotan landscape, under these vast skies. And, similarly, Brett and Steve, I mean, you have these great horizontal motifs of freight ships, moving down this river. And there's just a lot of attention to really capturing the tactility and beauty of what we're, witnessing. Maybe I'll start with you both, Rob and John. Just how important was it for you, in addition to capturing the story and the importance of the nonpartisan league, to also make a very pretty movie?
Well, John is again in this case, since his primary job was the photography. He has a beautiful book of North Dakota landscapes. What's it called? Below the Sky. Below the Sky. This guy has an eye, but also we watched the Russians. We knew where that type of black and white stuff came into being. We also were familiar with perhaps a bit later, the Iranian cinema, Taiwanese. We came to know where pictures were, not only from our own sensibility, but through the art of the past. And without that, I don't know that we would have been able to be so clear and just aware of all the parameters, the sky, et cetera. John, you should be talking about this because it was your primary.
Well, the landscape is a character in the film. It's as important as all the other characters, and because I had lived that landscape, my life out there for years, and photographed it with still photography, and including black and white. It was important for me to capture what it's like to be a tiny little human in that huge landscape. And it's a metaphor in a way for the forces that because they're against the forces of nature as well, like that blizzard that hits the threshing, which, by the way, was not in the script. But when we started filming, it was the last day of filming because it had been 30 or 40 below, which we were filming in anyway, but we couldn't ask all those farmers and bring the horses and everything out for the threshing scene until the temperature went up. And finally, we had a phone chain with the farmers, and at dawn we would have this discussion, could we shoot it today? So somebody says, yeah, it's going to be 0 today. So we went, right? And of course, they had been through that anyway. They had threshed in terrible winter conditions, because winter sometimes hits the Dakotas and so on. So we go out there, and we're shooting the scene, and pretty soon the blizzard is getting worse. We keep shooting. In fact, I was on a second camera, handheld, hiding from the main camera, which was shooting from inside a van with heaters blowing on it. Judy Irola was shooting that camera, and it got worse and worse. And finally, I had a camera with a wild motor, right, that you could change the speed, and I could hear it go, right, and it froze up, and finally it got so bad that we had to give up, and that shot of them going off into the blizzard, right? So then we had to go back to San Francisco and rewrite the script to fit that scene. So sometimes you get lucky and you get something like that. But the landscape always, I mean, those people are right salt of the earth. I mean, they live with all the weather, they live with all the prices, the landscape, the land, and the place they live in is their soul. So you have to present it in a film like this.
I got to say quickly, it reminded me so much of the moment when, at the height of the ALU's organizing, we were doing these sort of like day and night shifts, trying to keep up with the guys. And I woke up in my car because I had taken just a quick nap to the sound of like a few people just screaming bloody murder and huge, gusts of wind. And I look out, and there is the tent flying up, 25 feet in the air, and Chris and Josiah barely holding on for their lives. And so, that was such a kind of testament to the endurance and the exhaustion, but also the determination that these guys had to kind of like weather all the elements, environmental, emotional, economic, to try and get this thing done.
Yeah, and one of the things we would talk about in terms of visual style and visual sensibility was just sort of like how to make cinematic the contrast in scale. We're primarily filming at this bus stop, and the ALU has erected a tiny little tent, and they're sitting under a tent by a fire at a bus stop day in, day out. And they're working for the largest corporation in the world, and this one warehouse is connected through a very, very complex system to every other place in the world. And so the visual motif that
they're not
represents
riding a buggy, down. They're not Dakotan sort of landscape.
No,
and knocking
our
on
nature. We didn't have as much nature in our. We had some ducks that were really prominent, but we had these incredible ships, which are, I'd call them sublime, right? They're beautiful in the impossibility of like understanding how large they are, how much distance they're traversing. One of my favorite photographers is and visual artist is the photographer Alan Sekula, who does a lot of photography and made a film called The Forgotten Space that's premised on the idea that the best place to see capitalism is from the bow of a cargo ship. And I was thinking about that a lot. We watched The Forgotten Space as a reference for this film, but like how do we get at this sense of this contrast in scales and do so, in a way that gets at like what is both beautiful but also horrific about the sort of like the scale of this company that's dominating the planet and what this group of people is up against.
But there is a very interesting visual kind of linkage between sort of the rural agricultural workers who are at the forefront of this movement and, Amazon workers who are cloistered away in urban sort of swampland. So it's out of sight, right? Out of mind in many ways, just like, the protagonists in your film. And the actual farm workers of that era, like by design, right? I think capitalism seeks to not allow these injustices to be very visible, right? So Amazon very deliberately chooses these kind of like very geographically important locations, but in an area of very cheaply purchased land, or at least land that nobody can access very easily. And so, this is not like a storefront that you could look into and ever get a glimpse of as just the average consumer. We only click our way through the products and prices and next day delivery options.
Which means that workers have to travel, 3-4 hours from Brooklyn or the Bronx or wherever they're living to get to the Staten Island facility, which is like a story, I've heard people tell, just casually. That's a common thing that happens. But both of you, John, you mentioned the landscape as a character, and you're talking about these massive structures. I'm also thinking that they're characters as well. It's interesting that neither film has really a villain that you can that is a person that has a face. I'm not sure the landscape is necessarily the villain, but maybe it looms over like.
Well, we had the banker. Hold on.
That's true, but he's
was
on,
the banker of the town too.
But you also make him somewhat sympathetic. There's a part of him where he's like, he seems like he's like, I don't have a choice. The real villain is behind him, the system that's sort of making him make this. No. Oh, you thought he made that decision?
Not at all. Not at all.
All right.
But he knew what we were doing. He said, "I know what you're onto."
Oh,
and I'm going to do
actor.
what I would do if you thought I was a bad guy. And he did it. And also when they're during the actual foreclosure, the guy was Steele. He wasn't trying to pretend anything. He was being the guy that he wanted us to be, that he knew in his heart he was also. So anyway.
So the sheriff or whatever, the banker is the villain, right? Yeah. Nevertheless, I wanted to ask about like the use of architecture as kind of the villain. You see just the building looming over them in the background with the Amazon logo, the smile. It just is like part of the scenery. And you see this in the same way that the sky and like the danger of losing the crops and the consequent disasters, economic disasters that would befall them when that happens. Was this a conscious decision to not just continually return to Jeff Bezos news footage?
I think that, in so many ways, the story is about contradictions at every juncture, right? And so I think one of the things I'll just say is that there was always this sense that the architecture, the environment, everything spoke to kind of like every way we could articulate the bigness of that spoke to sort of how disempowered each and every person was led to believe they are in this film and, in the real world. And so I think that was something that, just in terms of the visuals, we wanted to kind of communicate the economy of scales that this was about.
Yeah, and I think just like choosing an individual hero to kind of lead a story is sort of both seems too easy, but also like serves the system as a whole. I think choosing an individual face to represent the system has the same effect, right? Like, and it's unfortunate that some of these people like become their own best villain caricature. Like it would be really easy to pick on Jeff Bezos, like so many, but then he's if it wasn't him, it would be someone else, right? There's something I think about often is something that one of the world leaders that was most instrumental in breaking unions in England, but also part of a movement of like breaking unions all over the world. Margaret Thatcher, one of the things she said often was, there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and their families. And I think that is meant to usher in a kind of mentality that, like, you know, there's no structure of power here. There's no like, you don't belong to each other. You are in it just for yourself. And like, even, you know, the idea of a union, which is a brotherhood or a sisterhood, an organism in which you are reminded over and over again, an injury to one is an injury to all, that becomes, you know, like in that sort of ushering in of an era in which there's no such thing as a society. Why would you need these organizations that are predicated on thinking of ourselves within society? So I think that, yeah, and that choice not to have an individual hero lead our story, it only made sense not to think about, even Amazon as a company, you know, wasn't really the enemy. I mean, it feels like it's the enemy of our film. It's the antagonist of the union, but Amazon is just an emblematic of like how capitalism is structured today. And so we see that building over and over again, but we were also cognizant in the edit room not to just keep saying Amazon over and over again. It's too easy also just to blame that one company.
Did you have that one barge that like says capital? Like I think the barge's name is Capital, which was...
And along the same lines, you know, John and Rob, there are scenes like there's the banker, there's obviously there's that scene of foreclosure, but actually a lot of the film is about the farmers talking amongst themselves about the conditions of work, you know, trying to get each other on board, trying to recruit people for the nonpartisan league and talk about conditions. Can you talk about that decision to make that really the focus of the film? Because again, there's just like Clint was saying, there could be a version of the film that's about Bezos. There could be a version of this film that's, you know, about the bankers, about confrontations, negotiations with the bankers, the railroad companies.
The most interesting thing about organizations is that when they're properly set up, the strong people come from it, and they come around it, and they come to it. But it isn't. But the best union is the union that has released the individual powers of people. And when I look at the face of people, I look at how they're dressed, I see the nature of their character. That's what fascinates me. And the groups, yeah, without the group, you're not going to have anything. If we can't find a way to stop these Trumpers and stuff, we're in deep shit. But still, I think John and I both felt the power of the individual was there for two reasons, perhaps. One was the hard work they had to do and the way that they had to work together to do it together. And secondly, they finally decided, hey, we can handle this ourselves. And they went forward individually and together to fight the system. And so to me, I think the faces of those people express that kind of innate power.
Well, and also, it's interesting in these two films, you start out with a very charismatic figure, Chris Smalls, right, who you think is going to be the lead, the main character of the film, kind of the hero. And as the film goes on, others emerge, and he's still there, and he is charismatic. He's an incredible personality to have focused on. I mean, unbelievable. And we start out with our main character who doesn't want to get involved, right? And he fights it tooth and nail. No, I don't have time. I'm going to get married. Nah, I'm too busy. I can't do it, right? And finally, things start to happen to him, and he starts to find out that he's being affected personally by this whole economic system, and he starts to change his mind. And his brother doesn't want to get involved either, and it takes him a good while to get involved. So, I mean, it's dramatic conflict, but yes, it's also being interested in how does somebody change? How does somebody decide to get involved in a movement like the Nonpartisan League, which was a truly grassroots movement? I mean, they went from farm to farm to farm, and And, there's talk in your film about dues. Well, the farmers, they had to pay $6 to become a member. In 1915, $6 was a lot of money. But that was a commitment that they felt the organizers needed to have that commitment, so people just didn't come and go as members. They put their money down, okay, I'm in, And it was an amazing strategy because it worked. And the other strategy they had that was fascinating is that they took over the Republican Party. But they ran candidates. They were called the nonpartisanly, but they ran candidates as Republicans, Democrats, and Socialists. And each of them all won, but they basically took over the Republican Party in North Dakota, which is quite astounding when you think about it. And then they formed a state bank and a state mill and elevator. They were acting like socialists. So it was just an amazing time. That was a rare moment in labor history here in the U.S.
And it lasted for what, like 6, 8 years before?
No, they lasted really 6 strong years through different elections. But then the corporate interests in Minnesota and elsewhere really organized. They formed a group called the Independent Voters Association, right? And they put money, and they accused them accused all of these farmers of being Bolsheviks, yeah. Right? And they had unbelievably cartoons, some of which you've seen in Prairie Fire. We used a lot of these cartoons. Compared to journalism today.
Remember, their magazine was called The Red Flame.
Yes.
And it was all filled with this garbage that we're talking about. But it was they organized also in 8 to 10 different states, and the Nonpartisan League and its success and that whole thing, socialism, I guess at the root in some sense was the root of the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota as well. So it wasn't just in that area,
which is still a force in the politics of Minnesota, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask then, kind of jumping off that, how making these films affected either your politics or your understanding of organizing, how it changed you or your thinking about that, and then also how it changed how the politics of making the film or the politics expressed through the film changed your approach to filmmaking. We can start with maybe the first one, if you guys want to.
That's a very big.
We'll start. We'll just do the first part. We can leave the filmmaking part out.
So tell me the first part again.
Just how making this movie made you rethink your politics or your own understanding of organizing.
And to that, just to add a little addendum to Clint's question, another actually similarity between your two projects, again, so many years apart, Rob and John sort of self-distributed the film for a long time through their collective. And I know that you guys are also really trying to distribute the film in a different kind of independent way. Self-distribution, I don't know if that's the right term, but there is this desire to really control how the film is disseminated. So maybe that's an entry point to also talking about
We're just layering the questions on.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the first part. I don't think it changed my politics. I think this film just deepened it. A previous film I had done was about a group of minority whistleblowers who set out to prove that the NYPD was operating with a very structurally racist kind of policy and practice, using kind of like this advanced statistical analysis of crime data in communities of color, and then applying that as a productivity quota that the cops in the NYPD have to meet. And so there was for me, like working on that project for about 7 years, was led to a very eye-opening kind of experience that oh wow, this is actually permeating through many other sectors and industries, this kind of highly dehumanizing technological approach to work and to safety and to even just product delivery and consumerism. And so I think for me, it just kind of helped me understand this project, that this struggle, like this race and class struggle, has to hold many kinds of identities, many kinds of social positions in order to be successful. And the reason that the Amazon Labor Union is here today is because the core group had many different kinds of people that were very different, perhaps in ideology, politics, personal lived experiences, but they shared this one conviction of purpose. And that was about addressing what was, inherently broken and dehumanizing about racial capitalism, or capitalism, period.
Yeah, for me, I think maybe before making this film, I might have, especially on a bad day, described myself as a melancholic leftist. I've been part of organizing, left and radical organizing groups for more than 20 years, and I wouldn't say the late 1990s or the 2000s were a particularly good time for organizing. So I've just seen like a lot of defeat and been part of a lot of like very important righteous groups that were small and didn't grow. And I think that I really needed to see a group. I needed to see my own pessimism disabused. And it was really incredible to watch a group of young people that I could recognize myself in at a more, I don't know, not even hopeful time, but just like who were doing something, with a lot of energy, and see myself in them, but also feel like tired and pessimistic about the effort, and then watch them commit and recommit and then win has like really lit a fire under my ass a little bit. And I feel incredibly grateful for that.
Well, I mean, Rob and I were part of a good left-wing collective in San Francisco, and we had many discussions about what kind of films we wanted to make, and we agreed we wanted to make films about people who didn't have a voice, and there were a variety of projects that were being developed, and actually the first film that went into production was about a factory worker in the East Bay who gets involved and has to decide if he wants to get involved in a black lead strike in a factory in Oakland. And I was the art director on that film, and Rob and I left that production early because we had to get out to North Dakota and shoot our film. But
I was the casting director on that film.
Yes, Rob was the casting.
What's the name of the film? Was it released?
Over, Under, Sideways, Down. Written and directed by Gene Core, one of our collective members, and Steve Wax, and it was shown on. It was taken up by public television and shown on public television back in those days. Wonderful film, but our film came out of a political environment that we were deeply in. I mean, we were hip deep in all of that. And so it fit perfectly. And I think both of us went on to make films which built on that. My next film was Wild Rose. It was about a woman working in the iron mines of northern Minnesota who has to fight sexism and even people in her own union to stay in the job. And then I made a film called Shimmer, which is about kids in a juvenile home in Iowa, set in the 1950s, who were being abused, and the main character is kind of an interesting, very smart kid who's 16 years old and has been abused in his life, and he makes a pal and they escape and they go in search of his mother. And so, these are the kind of films I'm interested in, and I know Rob can speak for himself in that situation.
Yeah, well, I took several other paths after that, but the one most pertinent perhaps for this meeting is my brother had been homeless for many years. He was a young poet, he was a young bright kid, and he got schizophrenia or something in college and disappeared. Went off on his own. He was and he was a principled homeless guy. he believed that you had to live off nature, so he'd go into the woods and he knew what mushrooms he could eat and work, and hitchhiked and walked all over America. And I say, so where's my brother? So I when I finished Heat and Sunlight, which was the one that won at the grand prize at Sundance, I was near the Tenderloin area in San Francisco, and I'm thinking, this is the kind of place that my brother might have ended up in. So I started to go down into it, and to begin with, it was a little bit scary for me because it was known. And there was a lot of gangs down there, and even now, it's one of my colleagues here got beat up when John Petrov, who works with me, going down trying to do some of the same things that I did. But anyway, the point being, I didn't find him, but I found the people on the streets, and I found a kind of a family that we put together, making a workshop available. So it was for homeless, inner city residents, all comers, and even if they wanted to, some actors. And for 12 years I was down there, and I don't even want to go into the methods that I developed, but my thing was, who are any of us? What is the presumption that I can make? That people are like this or like that or like this or like that. Now here's some people that are they're open out of necessity. They're against the grain, and there's a lot of misgivings and feelings, and you start to learn a lot about the polarities and the difference in people, and the strong, powerful things that drive them. So I didn't go towards labor organizing again. What I went towards was, who are the people and how are they living under these conditions? I did stuff about sex workers. I did homeless people. I did a number of different tacks, but all of them are tragedies. All of them are there. Not to show how life can be resurrected, but how catharsis can happen for audiences where they see people in these conditions and who are strong. Let's say that they're strong or weak, it doesn't matter. They are themselves. And the whole purpose of Greek tragedy and the purpose of the tragedies that I did in the Tenderloin was for that purpose. To let people know how deep the darkness is, and how at the end you may not be dead, but the struggle goes on. So it was an entirely different approach that I took, and those films, that's called the 9 at Night series, 9 feature films that start at 9 p.m. about 40 to 50 different fictional characters on America's rough edges. Wow. So that's where I went to begin with.
And sort of, I was interested in the distribution question also because it seems so much like, Clint's question about how your filmmaking changed through the politics of your subject. It seems to me that these distribution strategies are very much informed by what you documented in your films. Trying to be independent of big corporations, trying to reach people directly. I mean, in the press notes for Northern Lights, you guys went around showing the film, theater to theater. To me, that just evoked the image of the protagonist of your film going around farm to farm, talking to people. So I'm also interested in that, how you came up with distribution strategies maybe out of necessity and not like necessarily out of choice, but that seemed to sort of mirror the work that your characters did.
And also, let me say there's someone in the audience here without whom we couldn't have done it, and that's Sandra Schulberg, and the work that she and John primarily at the beginning did to start off the procedure. You go ahead and run with it.
Yeah, well, Sandra came out to North Dakota from New York because she was interested in the dilemma of independent films. Now we're talking about 1978. There were no other choices. There weren't distribution companies to go to. Nobody would take the film. Nobody wanted it. We had to do it. There was no choice. But Sandra also had a vision that this should happen, that we should get out there and distribute the film ourselves, and we did. Sandra and I went into town. Who owns the movie theater? Right? Oh, it's the guy at the hardware store. Okay, go over, introduce ourselves. We've got this movie. Well, we'd been getting publicity in the States, so they were aware of it.
You're
right?
lucky it wasn't the banker, right?
Yeah, true. And we'd make a deal right there, a handshake, and we made a great deal. We did a deal in those little towns, 70% of the gross to us, 30 to them. And we agreed, and like when we opened in Crosby, North Dakota, we gave 20% of our 70% to the local historical society and things like that. And so there was a route of the film going from town to town, starting up in northwestern North Dakota where we filmed it, then going to the Bismarck, the capital, going to the big cities in North Dakota. And at every time we had to keep going promoting. We'd use the money we got from the gross last week to pay for our promotion the next week, and just went from time to time. Finally, we had a booking in Minneapolis, the biggest city we'd been to, and we didn't break any box office records. We got a lot of publicity, but there was really a point there, if I remember it right, Sandra, there were, now what? And because we couldn't get bookings in New York or San Francisco, anywhere in the big cities, but we applied to the Cannes Film Festival, and by God, we got in. And we went, and we go to the festival, not expecting to win a prize, but to sell the film and get some more money so we get out of debt. And Sandra was key in that too, because she had already been there and had connections, and we sold the film, but suddenly it gets recognized by the international film critics. And we were in the section called Critics Week. And momentum builds. Suddenly we win the prize for the best first feature, The Camera Door, which, by the way, came with an Eclair ACL camera, so we could go back and shoot our next film with. Yes.
It was a real camera.
It was a real camera. Real
Solid
camera.
gold, I assume.
Yeah, and so.
Black on it.
And there's an interesting story, because San Francisco had a great theater called the Surf Theater, which is out in the near Golden Gate Park, and we knew the guy who owned it, and so we had talked to him about getting a booking in San Francisco because that's where we lived. Boys, no, I don't think there's an audience for this film. He wouldn't book the film. Well, he came to the Cannes Film Festival. After we win the prize, he comes up and he says, "Boys, I don't know what you did to that, how much changes you made to the film, but you've got a beautiful film right now, and I'll be happy to book it." We hadn't changed a frame. So, and it went from there. And then we did get bookings, but then we formed a new distribution company called First Run Features, which is still in existence. And then Rob and I and Sandra and some others in Minneapolis formed a company called New Front Films, and we distributed it ourselves as well for quite a number of years, until finally we sold it to New World Pictures. 1986, we sold it to New World Pictures. They brought it out on VHS. They sold some more international sales, but then it got buried in that library. And it's having a rebirth now, once we made the restoration, because of Kino Lorber taking it over. And so now we don't have to do it ourselves, thank God. We still show up, but we don't have to do all the work, and that's such a relief.
I still have 42 features that I have to do on my own. But with a couple of young people here helping me, my crew, Valerie and Jean, we are taking on the world. You better believe it.
I just got to say that Northern Lights is such an inspiring piece of cinema, because it's political in nature and also unapologetic about the raw beauty of wanting to make like a very thoughtful and interesting film that rejects the Hollywood system, right? I mean, you could have made so many cinematic choices, and you choose black and white, 16 millimeter, right? And the result is like stunning. It's so immediate, and it creates this kind of like narrative proximity in the way that you guys think about scene structure and character, and this idea of like this narrative slippage that does not kind of like force the story to hew to kind of a predictable arc that I think is more commercial, that would maybe assure a kind of distribution deal. And these are things like we were also thinking about, in a sense that like knowing, well, you know, a film about a group of workers who are taking on Amazon is probably not going to get distribution from Amazon, at the very least. Unless
did you try? I
mean, they might be that greedy, but we don't know yet. But, you know, for us, it was like very much about, you know, leaning into kind of like this idea of like form that's like political cinema can be something very challenging. And we don't have to meet the lowest common denominator of like viewership, that like we can take people to a place that like situates them, right? The way Cassavetes might create this kind of like uncertainty in the energy of like the scene, or the way Ricky Leacock used to talk about his obsession with like letting viewers feel like a sense of place and putting them there.
And you did that, the way you shot that film in the low light mode, whatever, the seamless sense of a kind of an endless night. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see the last part, but I was so taken by it. The texture is so beautifully smooth, and yet it's rough and tumble because of the nature of the Roman. But the picture allows you to enter it in a way that's really magnificent. I have to give you guys such credit. And that opening shot with that boat coming in, whoa! Oh,
Martin DeCicco.
What's that?
Martin DeCicco shot that. Incredibly talented.
Yeah, I'm not just doing it because we're on the floor together. I'm doing it because I'm pretty tough on films. There's so few that I like. I'm sorry about that, but I can't help it. My mom told me about be critical.
It's okay. We're a magazine for critics, so you're in the right spot, place.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that like the fact that we get asked every time we talk about this, whether or not we've sold to Amazon, I mean, it names the problem, which is that like, it's not just that one or two or three companies control media, or one or two or three companies control retail. It's that like the media corporate consolidation means that the entirety of our lives, including what audiences are allowed to see, is determined by a company that fought a union at its warehouse. And that is a political problem. So it's not just a problem that like, we made this movie, we really want to get it out there for our own egos or satisfaction. And yeah, we would also like to not have to do all the labor of that and have some support. But it's like audiences are being robbed of something that's quite fundamental to democracy, which is the opportunity to bear witness to things that are going on in communities outside of their own, and to see it through the form that cinema has to offer. They might have read this story in the New York Times or somewhere on Twitter, but cinema as a long form, as a form that plays and traffics in beauty and sound and strangeness and mood, has something else to offer an audience, and we're living in a deprived set of conditions when the companies that are also degrading us in the workplace are also depriving us of a media that might make us a more enlivened citizenry. So that is also galvanizing in terms of our commitment and determination to release this film and get it to audiences, in the hopes that it can be one more piece in a sort of like broader struggle for people to figure out how they can join with others and have more power over their lives.
I think that's a good place to wrap things up, because we're out of time. Unfortunately, I think we could continue to talk for much longer. There's much to talk about. But, on that note, it reminds me of where we started with John saying that he didn't learn about the Nonpartisan League in school. They didn't teach this. So having these stories told and having them made available to people, I think, is just a very important thing to happen. Like, we need to know about this part of history that people don't want you to know about, I guess.
Before we wrap, I'm just going to say Collective Protagonists has oh my God, that's the title of the talk. I'm so Northern Lights has its premiere tomorrow here. If you haven't seen it already, please seek it out. It's so worth seeing on the big screen. And Union opens in New York City on October 18th in just a couple weeks. So there's plenty of chances to see both films, and we obviously highly recommend it.
Is there going to be no Q&A?
Maddie, do we have time for a couple questions?
We were told before there was going to be a Q&A.
Okay. Well, we kind of pushed up. We would love to hear from the people.
The phrase I use is we have to roll our own. We can't depend on anybody. And just so what I want to say about what we're doing is after a well-known company wanted all my films, but then we read the fine print. No problem with them. They're doing what they do, and I admire them. But we're creating a new website for the sale of 50 movies, 150 art pieces, my poetry book, all that stuff. Roll your own. You've got to do it on your own. And what you guys are going to end up doing, I think, is probably something really great, because you have to. Because they don't care, and America is not educated well enough yet, as we can tell when we look at how many people are voting on what side and on the other side, for us to be able to depend on anyone else except ourselves. And I agree with Sandra, groups too, but be passionate in your own need, your own personal need with all, because you don't make a film by yourself. You make it with many, many other people, and all of them deserve everything you can do to get it out there. Roll your own and smoke your own too.
How about over here? Yeah.
This is amazing.
Oh, can you hold on for the mic? Well, we want to record it, so if that's okay with you. Here you are.
Thanks. Yeah, incredible. I mean, and the curating of the conversation. I wondered about, they have this thing now they call impact. And so I wondered, specifically, I was thinking, because, the character in Union has been, as you say, on TV and this and that. So I was always interested in that person. But I'm wondering how these unions now use your films, in the case of Amazon in particular, but also Northern Lights. I mean, these people are familiar. I mean, not so much the protagonists, but the makers, like Judy Irola, people that we know about for various reasons. So I'm just wondering how these people in the unions and who are in that struggle, how they use it. That's what they're calling impact these days. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, we've been really fortunate to have a lot of support on that side of things, in terms of there are some organizations that are very eager and recognize the film as a powerful organizing tool. So we've been in touch with many workers at work sites across the country, and also established unions who are interested in also supporting the dissemination of the film and getting it out to the sites. Yeah, I mean, one of the things about you could look at it as being forced into a self-distribution, or you could look at it as leaning into the reality that all filmmakers are facing right now, which is that, the studios and the monopolies that run the few media conglomerates now, they only want certain kinds of content, right, that they can commercialize. And so this allows us to kind of distribute the film in the spirit that we made it, in the spirit that the organizers that we filmed conducted their campaign, and really put it into meaningful conversation on our terms, right? Not in a way that you get disconnected from, like, as we were talking about like earlier, the product of your labor, right? That we can now activate the film in all the spaces at our choosing. And I think that that's been a really rewarding process. Our producers, Mars Verone and Sam Curley, and this organization called Red Owl, we've been working with closely to do just that and get it to all of the places that actually a traditional distributor would maybe overlook and view as maybe not germane to their bottom line interests.
In the back there, the gentleman in the brown sport jacket.
We should say that's Dan Sullivan, one of the programmers of Revivals, and he programmed Northern Lights, so,
Yeah, I was going to say, Rob and John, I'll save all my questions for tomorrow, so we'll have time. But this is for Brett and Steven. Do you think we could organize a screening of Union for the Film at Lincoln Center Union membership? Because we've been working and not able to attend the public screenings.
100%, and we won't even charge you.
Well, sorry, could you repeat that?
Just said absolutely, and we'll even do it for free. Just bring some popcorn.
Oh, right on. All right, we'll talk.
By the way, I wanted to say that my compatriots over here, Valerie and John and I, we have some flyers that we've made about our own attempts. And there's anyone who wants one, they're really kind of beautifully put together. And if you'd like to take one along, she just raised it up. And so we're doing our own politicking right here.
Resonance at Thursday screening. Brett and Steve were handing out their own little postcards.
That's right.
You guys are
Postcards are immortal.
I like this idea of branded rolling papers, though. I think that's the next step.
Ooh, really?
We might still. We're going to have a little merch shop, so maybe we might borrow that idea.
That's rolling paper.
Well, thank you, everybody on the panel. We appreciate you joining us, and we encourage everybody in the audience to see their films. And thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you
all for coming.
Thank you so much.